Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and, well, both to be here speaking and to be here in person. It's wonderful to be able to see you all again for conferences, and well done to you guys for everything you've done organising this. Thank you. So yes, what I'm going to be talking about today is kind of a slight offshoot from my PhD research, which has been about Spartan monuments quite generally. And here I'm going to be looking at artistic forms and how the Spartans tried to manipulate, or perhaps really how they just continue to use certain artistic forms to create and perpetuate the image, which I suspect we're all quite familiar with, of Sparta as a fairly austere and in particular old-fashioned traditional kind of place. And so rather than engage with the sort of the iconography and real close readings of artistic styles, the kind of which we've seen so far today, I'm looking a bit broader just at kind of shape and outline. And in particular, this is what has drawn me to ideas of aniconism and iconism, which is a nightmare to say. But there's just a little scale up there for you on this slide of roughly what I'm talking about. So iconic images are fully anthropomorphic statues, or statues where it looks like a person. A lot of the images I'm going to be talking about today is contrasting those kind of iconic anthropomorphic statues with what would be group 2 and group 3 on this slide. So geometric shapes, particularly kind of large standing stelae, but also semi-iconic, semi-figural shapes. The best example of these from ancient Greece would be something like a herb. So you've got a tall pillar with just a phallus and a head. So it's not quite aniconic, but not an iconic statue either. And the kind of the genesis and the spark for this this paper came from a statue of Zeus that the Spartans set up at Olympia. And I absolutely love this monument, partially because it was excavated and well described by the Germans, but also because it is one of the very, very few monuments where we can match up archaeological and textual evidence, which makes it one of about 3 in the case of Sparta. And in this case, it's because the base is inscribed. Got the inscription there, and because Pausanias, when he visited the shrine in the 2nd century CE, quotes the same inscription. We can see that they match up, so we can be relatively confident that he's talking about this statue. Now, Pausanias associates this with the Second Messenian War, which most people take to mean the Helot revolt of the 460s. 465, there was a big earthquake in Laconia, and the Helots rose up and revolted. However, the great Anne Jeffrey questioned this association, largely on the basis of the surviving fragment of the base itself and the fact that it has this cylindrical cutting in the middle, which to her did not suggest an iconic anthropomorphic statue, but a semi-iconic one, more along the lines of the statue of Apollo at Amyclae, which is illustrated on the coin on the left there. This type of statue is relatively common, well, not common so much as enjoyed by the Spartans. We've also got the statue of Athena Chalkioikos there. And what Jeffrey argued was that dedicating an old-fashioned form of monument like this, even for the relatively conservative Spartans, seemed a little bit odd as late as the 460s. And so instead she associated this statue with a largely unreported uprising of the Messenian Helots around the time of the Battle of Marathon, which is basically only mentioned by Plato in passing, not picked up by anyone else. So the broad question that I'm trying to answer today is, could the Spartans have dedicated an old-fashioned monument like this as late as the 460s? And if so, why? Now, the natural place for looking at whether the Spartans were into old-fashioned stuff has always, the starting point is normally Pausanias, because he gives us our fullest description. There have to be a lot of disclaimers with Pausanias' evidence. He's writing a long time after archaic and classical Sparta, and what he says is not always reflective of any kind of reality. But one thing that does come out of his report is that he describes an awful lot of really old stuff in Sparta. So these are just some examples. The top one there, the shrine of Athena Area, had wooden statues, Soana, as old as any in Greece. It's always kind of quite hyperlative. The statue of Zeus Hypatos was the oldest image ever to be made out of bronze. This was hammered together in different bits. Other times there's just old statues or old images. I've given 3 examples there. There are several more. And other times he shows it with context that the statue of Artemis Orthia is brought back by Orestes, therefore it's really, really old. But it's actually that his description of that statue of Apollo at Amyclae that is most interesting concerning his attitude towards artistic style and age, because he directly associates the fact that it's been made without art or skill, techne, and the fact that it's really old. And he says, therefore, it's not the work of Bathocles, who was working in the second half of the 6th century. It must be even older. His evidence for that is the artistic form. This is all kind of unsurprising that, firstly, that Pausanias is interested in old stuff in Sparta, and that the Spartans were playing up to an old image of themselves in the Roman period. But that attitude about old statues and aniconic statues being associated is something that also has its roots in the classical period. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, mostly because this has been really well researched and kind of evidenced by Millet Geifman, who has a book, Aniconism in Greek Antiquity, from 2012, I think it is. But basically, her conclusion is that you can see the beginnings of this attitude, that there's this idea that the Greeks started off worshipping spaces and rocks and trees, and then they had weird aniconic, semi-iconic images, such as the Herms, and then they started making proper iconic statues. In the case of Sparta, there's also an interesting parallel in that Plato and I think Thucydides as well comment upon the fact that the way the barbarians do things in their day is the way that the Greeks used to do them. And if we kind of extrapolate and apply this to other things, that the Spartans are regularly described as doing things like the barbarians do, which might also suggest an old-fashioned way of doing things. So within those kind of attitudes, I want to look at the kinds of aniconic and iconic monuments that come up throughout Sparta. When I'm talking about monuments here, I've tried to avoid things like cult statues for the most part because they're a bit tricky. So I'm looking at things that have been dedicated by individuals or by groups that are celebrating things. I originally tried to do funerary monuments as well because they're really interesting, but that was one data set too many, I think. So what you can see in the archaic period is that there are quite a lot of aniconic images coming throughout Laconia. There's an awful lot in Sparta that I'll refer to a bit more later. But there's also some iconic statues about, including in Sparta. The most famous would be the so-called Leonidas statue, if people know that one, the smiling hoplite. But there's a couple of others as well, other figures as well. And down there on the island of Kythera, there's lots of really cool, nice archaic statues. There's a lovely couple of lions and things like that. What we see when we move into the classical period is pretty much the decline of iconic statues in Sparta. They stop coming up. And similarly at Corinthra as well. They disappear from Kythera as well, pretty much as far as we can see. They are still coming up in places. However, this map used to be much more populated. I've been systematically going through and double checking these things. And a lot of the time we're dealing with bases, which are described as being bases for a statue. But it's not always clear why we think it's a base for a statue and not some other kind of dedication. So this map may change at some point over the next few months. Good example in the top right corner there, kind of hidden behind the zoom thing, there's a little cluster of statue bases. Oh, it's all. It's all right. There's 3 blue dots there. That's all you're missing out on. It's okay. But that's a little set of 5 statue bases from the 4th century at the sanctuary of Apollo Tiritas, which I'm still trying to find out why we think they were statues. But this kind of this move away from having the iconic forms and the consistency and the repeated use of aniconic forms is actually demonstrated really nicely in just one closed example in what's called the Docana. This is a representation of the Dioscoroi, Castor and Polyeuctus. So in the 6th century, we have a whole series of reliefs where we see the Dioscoroi presented as figures. Sometimes they're also represented by the pithoi, by the pots in the middle. But as we move into the 5th century, the figures pretty much always drop out of these, and we end up with this strange looking thing, which is called the Docana. It's described by Plutarch in the Moralia as well. He says it's a symbol of the Dioscoroi and of brotherly affection and strength. So that's a nice kind of encapsulated image of how they were moving away from iconic imagery and sticking with the aniconic. Now, the most common form of monument dedicated in Sparta are ones for sporting victories, whether that's athletic or equestrian, possibly some musical ones as well, which is quite nice. But, what you'll see from the archaic period is that they're virtually all tall standing stelae. These are aniconic shapes. They don't even have much decoration in relief. A couple of them have a bit of relief, but broadly speaking, they're just slabs. One that is quite interesting is this inscribed base from Magula down near the bottom there. We don't know what the dedication would have looked like, but the base is inscribed in quite a lot of detail, so it probably wasn't another stele listing somebody's victories, because that would have been a bit redundant. So maybe something a bit more iconic there. If you continue into the 5th century, the overall number drops. One reason for that might be a difficulty in dating Laconian letter forms. You might have noticed on the previous one, there's a lot of things that are dated circa 500, and this is because we have no securely identified inscriptions from the first half of the 5th century from Sparta. Very few at any rate. But what we do see in the 5th century is that those stelae are carrying on. They're still being set up, and they're generally being set up by individuals rather than by the temples putting up lists of victors. The 5 down the bottom are all literary references, and they're all to things that are not stelae, a couple of them including iconic statues. So there is some evidence that iconic monuments did penetrate this illusion, but it's late literary evidence, and there are a few problems with it. So I'm going to mildly just push that to one side for a bit. So when you actually have a look at these things, the 2 monuments I've got up here are about 100 years apart, one from the start of the 5th century, one from the very end. And what you can see is that there are some consistencies in terms of that basic shape, the aniconic forms. Now, what's really interesting about the Damenon stele on the left there is that it's certainly not a humble monument. It's nearly 2 meters tall. It was dedicated at the sanctuary of Athena Chalkioikos. It lists the victories of Damenon and his son in a series of events in Laconia. So this is a prominent monument in a very prominent position. Damenon was clearly an individual of fairly considerable wealth and influence in order to set this up. And yet there's no deviation from that artistic form. It's still fitting in terms of its basic appearance with the other monuments around it. Damenon's power and influence and wealth are demonstrated through the size of the monument rather than through a change in iconography or style. And that's important because this is kind of confined to Sparta, because what we do hear about, again from Pausanias a lot, is that there were an awful lot of iconic statues of Olympic victors set up at Olympia. In fact, they actually went and basically dominated a whole area of the sanctuary eventually. But there were no sister monuments for them set up in Sparta itself. So that they were apparently free to pursue this artistic agenda and experiment with new forms and compete with other Greeks outside of Sparta. But back home, there was an attempt to keep that image consistent and not have people break the mold. And eventually these dedications were kind of trumped monumentally by the one from Caniska, the Spartan princess. There's a fragment of the base of her monument, one of her monuments, I should say, from Olympia there, which was probably life-sized or maybe a little over life-size. So it was a huge statue dedication. The only thing that we've found that she dedicated in Sparta is this small Doric capital. It probably would have had a little dedication on top. We're not quite sure what, but it's very small. It's probably not holding a statue. It's not holding a statue group, for example. So there's still that kind of consistency. The best example might be, sadly, entirely literary, an athlete called Chionis, who had a stele set up in Sparta, which listed his victories, and who also had a matching stele in Olympia, but a statue that went with it. So we see happy to erect statues elsewhere, not so much at home. And that because of those attitudes to Aniconism that I highlighted earlier, these ideas that these forms are older, they're traditional, it gives off this air of archaism for the city as a whole. There's actually no real major building works that go on in Sparta either in the 5th century. All of their big public buildings and their temples reach a fairly finished form in the mid to late 6th century. So the fact that there is, whether it's a state-imposed ban or whether it's a collective buy-in to this refusal to engage with new artistic forms, is giving the whole city that air of consistency, being traditional, which is then also highlighting the stability of their political system and all of these other things that kind of come along with the Spartan image, that they say that they've been ruled the same way forever. And if we leave the realm of sporting dedications and look at military ones, there's actually a similar pattern that emerges. The biggest Spartan victory monument is the Aegis Potami monument set up by Lysander at Delphi. This was fully iconic. There's 39 statues at least, absolutely huge. If we go back a bit before that, their typical way of dedicating was medium to large bronze vessels dedicated at sanctuaries like Olympia, mostly at Olympia, some from Delphi, some from Dodona, a couple from Samos. I've counted 44. They were certainly not all for military victory. They're probably not even all from the Spartans. They're just made in Laconian workshops. But there are some that are inscribed to show that they're dedicated by the Spartiates collectively, which suggests it's not a sporting dedication, and so military victory is probably the most likely. It might be that they're just really pious and wanted to give a religious offering, but that seems a little much even for the Spartans. Sadly, these bronze vessels kind of die out after 500, which is a shame because it means we can't say whether they're still doing consistent things. The next victory monument we hear about at Olympia is a golden shield, which they fix onto the temple for the Battle of Tanagra in 457, which is a shame we can't make it more complete. But if we return to Lysander, he dedicated that big statue group at Delphi, and yet when he went and dedicated in Sparta, he stuck with the established form at Amyclae, which, like the vessels dedicated at Olympia, was a series of tripods, though actually tripods with statues underneath, so not fully aniconic, but a consistent traditional form. So the evidence isn't as full as we'd like it to be, but I hope there's enough there that shows that there was a consistency in how the Spartans were dedicating, at the very least, at home. And that means we can come back to the idea of this statue and sadly still not be able to say anything with as much certainty as we might like. But I hope what I've shown is that the Spartans do go in for traditional or outdated monuments. Traditional might have been better, to be honest. And that they continue doing this all the way through the 5th century. And if we take the idea that this was to show their stability, to show their consistency of way of life, this would also have a really big impact on a dedication put up for a victory over the revolting Messenian Helots, who at this point had been under the thumb of Sparta for about 200 years, a little shy of 200 years. That this is an artistic, that through the artistic form, this is reminding the Helots of the subjugation that they've endured and how long they've endured it for, and how Sparta is traditional and enduring and unchanging. So that's all I've got. Thank you very much.